Great. So after step 4, you are now capable of taking any argument that one places before you and diagramming it, coming up with a graphic representation of the structure of the argument. This is crucial because it means that you have the ability to understand any argument as the arguer intended. And up until now, that's what our focus has been on, just simply coming up with a good faith, accurate understanding of any given argument. But with this step, with step 5, we start the process of actually evaluating arguments, answering the question, should this argument persuade me? Is it convincing? We know that the arguer wants it to be convincing, believes it to be persuasive, but the question now becomes, what about you? How do you determine whether this is an argument that should persuade you of its conclusion or whether you should reject it? A couple of general points before we start on the first of 3 questions we're going to end up asking of premises in particular in order to determine their quality and their effectiveness. First, keep in mind as you make judgments about an argument, you're always making those judgments from your own particular position. That is, when we ask about whether a certain premise is acceptable, the question really is the premise acceptable to you? You come to that judgment with your own background knowledge, with your own historical perspective, with your own particular location. That in and of itself is neither problematic or to be avoided. The second point, however, is related. When you make an evaluation about a given premise, when you determine whether it's acceptable, whether it's relevant, for example, you need to back up that claim. The mere fact that you make that decision may not be persuasive to someone else reading your evaluation of that argument. So 2 things. You come with your own background information, your own historical location, and you must explain your decisions. So the 3 questions that we're going to ask of any given set of premises that are involved in an argument are, first, acceptability. That's the current step that we'll be talking about in more detail in just a second. 2, relevance. Are the premises relevant, which is a distinctly different question than whether they're acceptable. And third, whether the premises are sufficient. Another way of putting this is sufficiency of grounds. We use this acronym in order to help us remember that the 3 main questions we ask of any set of premises that are involved in an argument are acceptability, relevance, sufficiency of grounds, the ARG conditions, the first 3 letters of the word argument. That's easy to remember. Okay, so the first criteria that we're going to be asking about any given argument is whether the premises are acceptable. Let me tell you what the structure of the answers that you'll be providing to these exercises, and then go into a little bit more detail about what acceptability means. Now that we're actually evaluating the arguments, you're still going to be doing the diagramming, because as you'll see, especially in step 6, the accuracy of your answers to the questions will depend heavily on the accuracy of your diagram. So you'll be given an argument, and just like you did in the last 2 steps, you'll provide a diagram of that argument, and then you'll provide another list whereby you list every single premise that you've isolated in the argument and make a judgment about that individual premise. Now, this will be a little bit different when we get to relevance and sufficiency, but for acceptability, you evaluate each premise individually, one by one, no matter where they show up in the argument, no matter where they show up in the diagram, and it also doesn't matter whether they're dependent or independent. So after you do your diagram, just like you've been doing, you'll also have another list that will go like this. You don't need to repeat the premises. I know what they mean, just using their numbers. And you will make a judgment. You say this premise is unacceptable. You actually have 3 options, and I'll go into that in just a bit. Acceptable, unacceptable, or provisionally acceptable. Now, that's your judgment, which is an important part of the process. That's you saying, I've looked at this premise and I've determined that it is unacceptable to me at this point in time. Notice, however, that right now you haven't justified any of those decisions. You haven't explained any of those judgments. Just as important in this step as your actual judgments are your explanations for those judgments. On what basis are you determining that premise unacceptable or acceptable. That is going to have a very large role to play in the quality of your evaluation. To a certain extent, and there are exceptions to this rule, to a certain extent, I, as an instructor, when I'm teaching this class, care less about what my students decide, what conclusions they come to, than how they get there. How did their logical process lead them to a specific decision on each individual premise? Every single premise is evaluated, including unstated premises. They're treated just like any other premise, okay? So this is what the answers for step 5 exercises are going to look like. Again, keep in mind, you're still going to be doing the diagramming. Okay, so let's now talk about how acceptability functions and how you can decide whether any given premise is or is not acceptable. When we're talking about a premise and whether it's acceptable or not, we're really looking at its content. Again, it's going to be different in the next 2 steps. But we don't need to know very much about where the premise shows up in the argument. Remember, every premise is an assertion. It's a claim. You may have had to paraphrase it. You may have taken a rhetorical question, for example, and reframed it as a statement or as an assertion. But by the time you're dealing with a premise, you know you're dealing with a claim. In short, acceptability asks this question: do you accept this claim? Now, sometimes it's a matter of truth or falsity. I could say that a claim may be that door is open, and therefore I could just simply find out, is the door in fact open? It is either true or false, and I could figure that out. But all premises and all arguments don't constitute facts in that sense. They may be opinions, which may be perfectly good grounds for excellent arguments. So if I might say, Nick Nolte is washed up, that's not exactly a fact. Different people may disagree with it. It involves judgment, it involves opinion. The question is, do you hold that claim to be true, and on what basis? So for acceptability, we're really looking at the content of the claim. And we can do that by really isolating it from the argument, going right down the list for each premise. Do I think this is true? Do I think this is true? Do I accept this? Do I find this to be the case? Now, that being said, there are some basic patterns or some very common ways in which premises can either fail or succeed at acceptability. I'm going to go through quite a few of those ways, and although the list is relatively long, it's not exhaustive. There are many, many ways in which premises can fail. So don't make the mistake of thinking that every premise will fall into one of the categories that I'll give you here. These are just some common patterns that you can be on the lookout for, that fall under the general umbrella, do you find this premise to be acceptable? So, what could make a premise acceptable? The first one, ironically enough, is one that you're not licensed to use yet. A premise can be acceptable if it's supported by a strong sub-argument within the argument. Now, why can't you use this yet? Well, because we've only started on the very first of 3 steps that we're going to need in order to determine whether an argument is persuasive. So you don't have all the tools you need in order to determine whether an sub-argument, which functions just like a regular argument, is strong or not. But it's important to keep in mind that sometimes you'll accept a claim because the argument itself provides enough good, strong evidence for it. Now, arguments aren't infinite. Not every premise can be backed up by a premise within that argument, or else arguments would never end. So another reason that you can accept a premise is that you know it to be supported elsewhere. So if I'm reading an article and it says that the Red Sox won the 2004 World Series, I wouldn't say you have to provide me evidence of that. I know from my former reading that in fact that is the case, that the Red Sox did win the World Series in 2004. And if I can, the more specific I can be about where I learned that and the quality of the source, the better. We depend on this kind of support all the time, and often quite appropriately so. But the fact that we depend on it so frequently is a good reason to make sure that our sources from which we get information are as strong as possible. So if we regularly read, let's say, magazines that don't have the most robust fact-checking offices, we might have to be a little dubious about our memory that we read this somewhere. If we can be specific about where we read it and that that is a high-quality source of information and analysis, then we can have more confidence in our own evaluation. Okay, the next one is tricky too. We can accept premises based on common knowledge. Now, we all know of tons and tons of examples where common knowledge was false. The stereotypical one being that people once believed that the world was flat. Apparently that wasn't as widespread a belief as is sometimes represented. But we've had lots of examples where common knowledge turned out to be false. And that should give us pause. None of these ways in which premises can succeed on acceptability are excuses not to think critically. You still have to think very critically about how you're applying these particular ways in which premises can succeed. Also, it's important to remember that common knowledge is context-specific. I teach at Elon University. Our president is Leo Lambert. If I'm making an argument on Elon University campus that includes the claim Leo Lambert is our president, I don't have to back that up. That's common knowledge in this particular community. If I went to a different community, it may not be common knowledge there. So one has to be very clear about which community one is speaking to and from in order to determine whether common knowledge is an appropriate basis upon which to accept a premise. Okay. Premises can also be accepted on the basis of personal testimony. You and I cannot be everywhere at once. We cannot see, hear, witness everything at every point. Sometimes we have to accept claims because other people have seen, witnessed, experienced something. Now again, this is not a blank check, and there are certain questions we have to ask before accepting personal testimony. Specifically, is the claim plausible? So if a very good friend of mine said, I was out at the fountain at midnight and aliens dropped into it. I saw it, you should believe me. Okay? And even though that person has been very reliable up to then, that claim may be so implausible that I might not accept it. Okay, related to that point, we have to consider the reliability of the source. A constant bane of all district attorneys everywhere who need to use all sorts of different people as witnesses, sometimes experts, sometimes informants. How reliable is the source? If you happen to know a person who's a pathological liar, even if their personal testimony is fairly benign, you may still reject it. You may still not accept it because they don't have a high degree of reliability. Okay. One more, I can fit it on here. We might accept a claim if it's based on proper authority. You and I are not experts in everything. I cannot question every single claim that a plumber might make as they come in to fix my house. So I might accept something on the basis that someone else has expertise that I don't have. Again, this is not an excuse not to think critically, particularly about this part. The proper authority. We have, let me start that again. There's a convention in our culture that people who hold doctorates of all sorts are all called doctor. And that can make it difficult to distinguish from between a doctor of philosophy, say, and a doctor of physiology. One of my favorite examples of proper authority being abused is Dr. Laura Schlesinger, who was a very popular radio, TV host. She still has a show now, but she was very popular in the 1980s, giving advice on marital relationships, on how to raise children, sort of life-living lessons. And she would have people call up and say that their lives were disordered in some ways, and she would give them advice on how to fix it. And she very much used the doctor in her name. She was Dr. Laura, which would seem to imply that she had some advanced education, perhaps in psychology, perhaps in social work, perhaps in something about family dynamics. In fact, she had a doctorate in physical therapy, so she'd be a great authority if your knee was blown out and you wanted to get it working again. But she had no actual expertise, authority, or education in the very subjects that she was speaking about. So in that sense, she had authority, but not of the right sort. We have to make sure the authorities are of the right sort. Okay, those are some ways in which premises can succeed at acceptability. Let's look at some ways in which they can fail at acceptability. ways in which you would say that this premise is not acceptable to you. And the first is the easiest. Some premises are easy to refute because they're simply and obviously wrong. So if someone made the claim that Sona Sotomayor is the first woman nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court, that would be easy to refute just by mentioning the names of Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So easy refutability is simply when the claim is wrong, one can make one or two statements showing that it's wrong, and you're done. Much more difficult, and this is one of the few times where you have to look at the structure of the argument with regard to acceptability. And that's in the case where premises contradict each other. That is, in the context of a single argument, an arguer can't make two premises that are necessarily opposed to each other and expect both to be deemed acceptable. So let's consider the question of legalization of marijuana. Some person might make the argument that marijuana should be legalized because one reason is because it has little to no physiological effects. It's a fairly benign substance. It doesn't really change much of anyone's personality or cognitive abilities. And then they might also make the claim that marijuana should be legalized because when one uses marijuana early in the day, one is a much more productive, happier person, and therefore it would maximize the happiness of more people. Now, these two claims are contradictory. If marijuana has little to no effect, it cannot therefore have a positive effect. It has to be one or the other. Now, when you're faced with premises that contradict each other, you've got a couple options. You're well within your rights to reject both of them without looking too much further, saying you can't have access to either one of those premises. I think a slightly better approach is to accept the premise that is more plausible for the moment, reject the less plausible premise, and then reconsider the one that's left. So in the marijuana example, one could say, which is more likely, that marijuana does have a significant effect or that marijuana doesn't have a significant effect? Reject the one that you find least plausible and then reconsider the one that's left. Okay. Premises can also lack clarity. Sometimes you've worked on an argument, you've rephrased the premises as best you can, and you still don't have a clear idea what they're saying. It's just not clear. It can be not clear in a variety of ways. The claim may be overly vague. Professor X is a good professor. Good in what way? Good at what part of professor's job? It's very vague. It's hard to even know what that claim actually means because the language is so general and so imprecise. Another way in which claims can lack clarity is by being ambiguous. So you might see on a recommendation the claim, I can't tell you how many times this person saved a project from near and utter ruin. Well, that claim could actually have two distinct meanings. I can't tell you how many times that person saved a project because it never happened once, which is the reason I can't tell you of exactly one. Or it happens so often that I can't tell you how many times it is. So any claim whose clear content you cannot isolate, you cannot tell exactly what is meant by that, you should reject out of hand. Okay, premises can depend on faulty assumptions. So if someone were to say to you, you really shouldn't take this class because it has tons of group work, okay? The assumption there being is that you're not good at group work. So if the class has a lot of it, you shouldn't take the class. But that may be a faulty assumption. You may have to say to your friend, actually, you may not know this about me, but I'm great at group work and it's my preferred method of learning. So any claim that rests on a faulty assumption, whether that assumption is explicitly or implicitly articulated, should itself be rejected. Claims can emanate from a biased source. So, the Illinois state legislature passed some legislation calling Springfield, Illinois, the chili capital of the world. So the legislature made a claim. Springfield, Illinois is the chili capital of the world. Makes the best chili out of everywhere, okay? Now, when I look at that claim and I say, now, do I accept this? is Springfield, Illinois really the chili capital of the world, I have to take into consideration who is making this claim. The Illinois legislature is not an expert on chili. What they are an expert on is managing PR for their state. And what their real purpose is in passing some legislation that calls Springfield the chili capital of the world is making sure people will come visit. So I'm going to reject that claim, especially given that it sounds pretty unlikely. My guess is that Springfield, Illinois is not, in fact, the chili capital of the world. Okay. This is one of the very few fallacies that I'm going to talk about in these 10 steps. Fallacies are nothing more than common patterns of logical error that crop up with persistence, and they crop up repeatedly in many of our arguments. Many critical thinking classes spend a lot of time talking about the dozens and dozens of fallacies that philosophers have given names to. I don't spend a lot of time on that because these 3 questions that we're going through right now, if you apply them correctly, you'll find every single fallacy that the philosophers have ever talked about. But I'll use the term for this particular fallacy, which is called begging the question. This is a fallacy whereby the premise, rather than leading you to the conclusion, rather than giving you a reason to accept the conclusion, actually already assumes that the conclusion is true. That the premise couldn't even be articulated unless the conclusion is true. This is not the same as the premise and the conclusion being in some ways consistent. It's that the premise actually already assumes the conclusion. Here's an example. If someone wanted to convince you that you really should drop everything you're doing and join the fight against climate change, they might say something like this. Look, this is really serious. Climate change is really serious. If you don't do something now, your kids are going to be angry at you 20 years from now. That's why you should do it. So here's the premise. Your children will be angry in 20 years if you don't do this. Therefore, either, let's take the form of what I'm thinking right now, climate change is very serious or you should do something about it. But here's a reason to believe that it's serious. Your children will be angry in 20 years. The problem with this claim, your children will be angry in 20 years if you do nothing, is that it doesn't prove that climate change is serious. It assumes that it's serious. The conclusion is already sort of embedded in the premise, which is not logical. The conclusion itself has to emanate from the premises. It can't already be embedded in there. Okay, as I said before, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the patterns that you could keep an eye out for as you determine whether premises are acceptable or not acceptable. Now I want to return to something that I mentioned a little earlier on, which is that you actually have 3 options when it comes to acceptability of premises. You've got 3 decisions, 3 kinds of judgments that you can make. 1, you can call a premise unacceptable and then explain exactly why you're making that judgment. 3, you can say, no, I accept this premise. I hold it to be true, and tell me why. Now, keep in mind, the explanation is crucial here. If you say this is acceptable because my mom says it is, that's probably not a great reason to accept a premise, depending on what the premise is and depending who your mom is. You have to back your judgment up. I usually say to students, like 2 or 3 steps beyond what you think is reasonable before philosophers will consider it to be substantial. But here's the 3rd option. There are times when we're faced with a premise and we don't have the expertise, we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the wherewithal to really determine whether it's acceptable or unacceptable. So someone can make a claim, say, about the proportion of the federal budget that goes to scientific study. And they make that claim in the context of an argument. Off the top of my head, I don't have enough background knowledge to know whether that particular claim is acceptable or not. Now, if the claim itself seems utterly implausible, just unreasonable, that would be reason enough for me to not accept it, to say this just doesn't make much sense, okay? But if it's generally plausible, I might call it provisionally acceptable. This is not the same as determining that a premise is acceptable. This is your way of saying, I'll consider it acceptable for now until I have time to go do the research and find out whether it is true, okay? But it's reasonable. The person seems to be a good, non-biased expert source. I'm going to accept it for now. Do not use this option of provisional acceptability as an excuse not to make a judgment. This doesn't happen all that often, depending on the kind of arguments you're making. Okay? So you only make it in those cases where the premises seem plausible, but you don't have the background knowledge or the necessary expertise to really know whether they're acceptable or not. Okay, so let's just review. We're starting with step 5 to learn how to determine whether an argument is persuasive. Now remember, these are questions that can be posed to any argument of any length, of any content, of any context. So the first question that we've been focusing on right now has been acceptability. Do you accept the premises? You'll be given an argument, you'll do a diagram just like you've been doing for the last 2 steps, and then you'll have another list where one by one you evaluate each premise, generally speaking in isolation from each other. Good luck.